Thank you for joining us, right? Thank you for Dr. Noam Kochavi for hosting us really in your class, and thank you for many students here, many of my students as well. Thank you for coming, right? And of course, thank you to our guest, the journalist Franklin Foer. I think this is a very timely event, given everything that's literally right now happening in the headlines, right? Regarding a potential hostage deal that I know we were all crossing our fingers and praying for. And I think that is something Franklin in the Q&A could address, because he has a lot of experience in reporting about what the back channel and what is happening behind the curtains of these negotiations for the past year and a half. So I think we're also very fortunate to have him here today. I want to briefly introduce Franklin Foer. Franklin is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's the author of The Last Politician, Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future, and also the book World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech. He was previously the editor of The New Republic and the staff writer at Slate and New York Magazine. His other books include How Soccer Explains the World and Jewish Jocks, co-edited by Mark Tracy, a book which won the National Jewish Book Award. So today, Franklin will primarily talk about the Biden doctrine and really American foreign policy and diplomacy in the Middle East after October 7th. I think the best way to do this is I'll invite Franklin and he'll give a short outline, maybe 30, 40 minutes, an outline of his article in The Atlantic Monthly that really that summarized and kind of explored what American foreign policy in the last year and a half, and then maybe we'll open it up for a Q&A, which is, right, I invite everyone here to have, we'll leave a lot of time for that, so you could ask Franklin questions and really interact with him. I'll just mention, right, that this is a collaboration between the Center for U.S. Studies at Tel Aviv University with our partners, the Stephen Roth Institute here for the study of contemporary anti-Semitism and racism, and also the Simbalista Jewish Heritage Center and the American Studies program where I am a faculty member. So without further ado, I think, please, Franklin, let's come on up, and we are really thrilled that you're here, and we want to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
So speak into the microphone. Okay. So I guess my journey with this began, right before, I guess in the summer before Joe Biden won the presidency in 2020, my book publisher asked me to write an inside account of the first 100 days of the Biden administration, because they were going to be coming to power at a time when the COVID pandemic was raging, the economy was on the precipice, and they would have to enter the government to undo everything that Donald Trump had done to the government. And I said, great. And so I started to work on a book about the first 100 days of the Biden presidency, which turned into a book that I wrote about the first 2 years of Joe Biden being president. I chronicled the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the way in which he passed domestic legislation. And so that book came out, and I was watching everything unfolding after October 7th with extreme concern, fascination, interest. And at a certain point during the war, I went back to all of these people who I'd gotten to know in the course of doing my book at the State Department, at the National Security Council. And I started to ask them if it would be possible to do kind of a fly on the wall, inside the room reconstruction of all of the diplomacy that had happened beginning on October 7th, extending through whenever. And it was this type of project that I did where it was a big open-ended ask. And I was leveraging relationships and trust that I'd built up over time. And I did it on the condition where I said, all right, just start telling me stories about what happened. And I don't know when I'm going to publish this. And initially what had happened, and this is kind of just an insight into the way that they were thinking about things at the time. They thought that there was going to be a deal, a Saudi Arabia-Israel normalization pact that would happen. And they thought it would happen some point last summer. And they said, okay, when you get to, we'll start telling you stories, hold off until the Saudi-Israel pact is finalized. And then you can publish your story and it'll be ultimately an inside account of the diplomacy that ended up brokering this deal. And so I said, fine, let's do that. And of course, I reached that moment last summer and I was like, guys, it doesn't look like this deal is ever going to happen. I need to publish this piece. I'm going to publish this piece. And they said, fine, you can use all the stories that we told you. And I think at that point, they were under so much pressure from especially kind of the base within their party who accused them of being unabashed apologists for the Netanyahu government, that they felt like it was, I think for them in part, they wanted the stories of all of these diplomatic efforts that they'd engaged in that hadn't really been fully surfaced to be explained to the world. So at least there would be a record that they were doing energetic diplomacy. My piece is, I called it an anatomy of a failure because on their own terms, the Biden administration articulated a certain set of goals for what they wanted to accomplish diplomatically. They wanted a hostage deal. They wanted the Saudi normalization deal. They wanted there to be some sort of arrangement for the post-war reconstruction of Gaza. And so those were their three biggest diplomatic initiatives. And obviously, we have, I think, 5 days left in the Biden administration, and they haven't achieved a single one of those. But I do think that there is at least some possibility that, I use this analogy. George H.W. Bush and James Baker did all of the work that went into producing the Oslo peace process, and then Bill Clinton got the signing ceremony in the Rose Garden. And I think with maybe the Saudi normalization deal and with some of the post-war reconstruction, maybe even the hostage deal itself, like all of this diplomacy will end up coming to fruition during the next administration. But my piece began really, so I engaged in this just kind of open-ended discussion where I didn't know what the main plot points were, because when it comes to the diplomacy, there's this huge incentive to keep everything kind of under wraps over time. And you don't really know what's important until you start having long, open-ended conversations with people. One of the things that I discovered was that the story for me really began on October 6th. That on October 6th, in the White House, Brett McGurk, who is the guy in the National Security Council who was charged with the Middle East, was engaged in finalizing negotiations with the Saudis about the normalization deal. And on October 6th, Saudi diplomats were in the White House talking to the administration about what a Palestinian state would look like, what the Saudis would sign up for. And there were very detailed blueprints that were being constructed about the contours of, at least on the Saudi end, they were thinking about what a power grid would look like in the West Bank. They were thinking about how the education system would be reformed in such a way that ultimately the Netanyahu government would feel comfortable signing on to this deal. Throughout this whole time, Netanyahu is calling Biden. Going back to January 2023, Netanyahu is calling Biden and telling him, I want a Saudi normalization deal, and I'm willing to throw out Ben Gvir and Smotrich from my coalition and reassemble a coalition with the centrist parties in order to make this happen, if that's what it takes to get it done. And, whether he was sincere in that, I leave it for you to judge. But that's what he was telling, and that was the thing that I think was stoking the diplomacy on this front. That they believed that if they could getting the Saudis on board was the easy part. And here's just an interesting thing about the way that the Saudis were thinking about this. The Saudis don't need a normalization deal with Israel on its own merits. When it comes to technology, they can buy anything that Israel has to offer on the open market. They don't need an economic relationship with Israel, especially. But what they do need is they need a defense pact with the United States that secures American air defenses, that secures promises of security guarantees for Saudi Arabia. And in order to get that passed through the US Senate, you need the votes of progressive Democrats who hate Saudi Arabia. And the way that you get those votes is that you supply a Palestinian state. That's the thing that makes it attractive. And so I think in Saudi, that's how MBS thought about this. MBS became an extremely shrewd student of American politics after the Khashoggi murder. That he understood that, I think he was very young when he came into power. He's still very young. I think that he understood that he was suffering and he didn't want to become a pariah within Washington, and he needed to find a way to preserve his power. The other thing that's interesting is that MBS made another calculation, which was at the beginning of the Biden administration, he was very, very seriously considering entering into an alliance with China or hedging his bets against American power by entering into an agreement with China. But he also watched the war in Ukraine and watched the way that Russia was fumbling. He watched the way that China had cast its lot with Russia, which seemed to him, I think, strategically unwise. He saw that American artificial intelligence is better than Chinese artificial intelligence. And he made a decision at a certain point that he was going to cast his lot with American free markets, the American Western economic system over the Chinese economic system. And in fact, in the normalization deal with the United States, one thing that I don't think gets a lot of attention or hasn't been fully reported is that it kind of makes commitments to the US dollar. It makes commitments to American artificial intelligence. That's why this pact is an extremely attractive thing, not just to the Saudis, it's extremely attractive to the US as well. Okay, so October 6th, this is percolating. That night, Brett McGurk in the National Security Council gets a text message from Michael Herzog, the ambassador to Washington, that just says, "We're under attack." Herzog himself, that night, he's in Arizona on vacation because of the holiday. And he heard from an Israeli general that he knew who called him up and said, "We're under attack, we're under attack, we're under attack," and then hung up the phone. And he didn't actually know exactly what was happening. He was having to go to social media himself to get the latest intelligence. And so McGurk finds out about this. Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, is on vacation in the south of France with his wife. And because the time zone in France is kind of more closely aligned with Israel, he starts talking to his counterparts in the Israeli security apparatus and he calls the Situation Room in Washington and he says, "Did we see this coming at all? Go through all the files. What did we miss? How did we miss that this was about to happen?" And so that night, young military aides are in the Situation Room looking through the files. They can't see any evidence that the United States knew that the attacks were coming. And so that morning, October 7th, aides start rolling into the White House. Tony Blinken starts briefing the president about what's happening. And I mean, as we all know, and we all remember, it was like so scattershot. Everybody was piecing this together as it was happening. And that was true for the president of the United States himself. And he was being shown videos on social media that, and it was the rawest sort of form. And it was completely rattling to him. I mean, he'd never seen anything like this. He was comparing it to him, the closest thing he could conjure was like, this is like what I saw ISIS doing. And aides told me that there were moments where he would just have to go out into the rose garden to kind of steady himself because he was so shattered by what he was seeing. They would get Netanyahu called, and they could just hear in Netanyahu's voice that he was overwhelmed, he was frazzled, he did not feel like he was in control at that moment. And he didn't necessarily have the full picture himself. And Netanyahu immediately started talking to them about how this is the Middle East. We're going to need to respond. We're going to need to respond in a big sort of way. If we don't strike back big, we're going to be seen as roadkill, and it's going to have disastrous consequences for it. And the response that whole day from the United States was, we're with you. When Michael Herzog texted Brett McGurk, he instantly texted back, we're with you. When Netanyahu called and was in his shattered state, Biden's response was, we're with you. But I think at a very early stage, Americans started to have their own questions about Netanyahu's strategy, because the idea of responding was something that they understood, they felt was more like, more than morally justified, but they wanted to know, where this was going to go. And so almost instantly, the Biden administration started sending officials to Tel Aviv on a rotating basis. And I think his idea was that, essentially that America needed to wrap its arms around Israel. It needed to kind of provide a steadying sort of presence. It needed to, I think, there was even some sense that, like, it was, when Biden came, this is actually interesting. So Biden, well, let me pause. So, the first, Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, was one of the first people to come, and he starts to have conversations with Gallant and the Kiryat, and they starts asking these questions that the U.S. would ask kind of over and over again, like, which is, what is your objective? How do you get out? Like, where is this going? Tell me how this is going to end. It's not that the United States had answers to those questions themselves, but they were playing this almost Socratic role in posing those sorts of questions to the government, and there was really no answer. And part of the thing that they discovered straight away was that while Israel has, had incredible plans for how to deal with Hezbollah, it did not have incredible plans for how to deal with Hamas. It didn't have plans to invade Gaza, that they were quickly improvising a battle plan. And that improvisation was happening in the state of just strategic shock, and sadness and anger and rage, and in a state of, like, what they identified as a state of almost shame that they felt like they were encountering among Israeli officials. And those weren't the best, they felt as if those were not the best conditions for constructing a battle plan. And so they continued to play this type of kind of almost like big sibling type of role in the construction of this plan. Initially, the battle plan that they saw, which was not even, it wasn't even a document so much as maybe some PowerPoint slides or conversations, involved sending 30,000 troops into Gaza. There was very little planning that was done to make allowances for civilians. It was really just kind of, I think the way it was described to me by some of the Americans who saw the plans, it felt like very old-fashioned thinking about warfare. It wasn't a state-of-the-art plan. It wasn't what you would expect from the IDF. And so the month of October, the big goal of Biden administration diplomacy was to help the Israelis slow down so that they could formulate a more sophisticated, more appropriate battle plan. And I don't know if Biden had initially planned to come to Israel, but Netanyahu, I think, improvised in one of these calls. He asked him to come. And actually Biden, I don't think he consulted anybody before he responded. He just said, I'm coming. And a presidential trip like that is something that usually involves an enormous amount of preparation. He was flying into like an active war zone, which requires even more preparation. The day before Biden came to Israel, there was talk of calling off the trip, because I don't know if you remember, Olaf Scholz came the day before, and there were these images of like him and his aides, ducking and covering on the runway. And up until the last minute, there was some talk of that not happening. And then there was the accusation the day before of that Israel had premeditatedly attacked the hospital, which was false, of course. But on Biden's itinerary, he was planning to stop in Jordan as well. And just before he's about to get onto the airplane, he gets a call from King Hussein, who says, "Joe, you can't come here. Like we can't have you come here because the emotions on the street are so raw." And so his advisors, hours before he was getting on the plane, were debating whether it was wise to send him, because they didn't actually know the truth about what had happened at the hospital. I think Netanyahu had called Biden and he said, "Look, Joe, we didn't do this. By the time you land, we're going to have intelligence that shows we didn't do this." But nobody in the White House was actually sure if that was true or not. And so Biden makes this decision. He says, okay, I need to come, and I'm going to come. And if I don't come, the consequences of that the psychological consequences of that for the Israelis would be so great that I'm willing to take a political hit. And so he comes, and it was very powerful for him because he has all of these private meetings at the Kempinski Hotel with people who had survived, with families of hostages. He's connecting to the events of October 7th in an incredibly visceral sort of way. Whatever one thinks about Ron Dermer, I think Ron Dermer told him a very, very powerful story about his own family and about the fear that he felt about going off to work, and the things that his wife had told him when he left the house on October 7th about his own fears for his own family. And it was these things mattered to Biden and to his aides. But then, in the course of having these conversations with the war cabinet, he basically says, "Look, I want to help you develop a better plan, and I'm going to send 3 generals here to have conversations with you to help you refine this plan." I think that was very annoying to the war cabinet and very annoying to Netanyahu, but there was really nothing that they could say to Joe Biden at that moment, because he was there. He was displaying friendship in in this very palpable, very meaningful sort of way. So they had they had to do it. They had to accept. And over the course of the last third week of October, the war plan does get refined, and it becomes the thing where it's a much more it's a phased plan. Interestingly, I think, and annoyingly for Joe Biden later on, is that Rafah was not part of that initial plan that was presented to him. I mean, I think it was maybe one of the failings of the plan, because Rafah is such an obvious, such obvious military strategic significance, because it's the way in which the arms flow into Gaza. And it was kind of, it's an interesting question why that was never part of the plan itself. I'm just going to compress a little bit going forward. I think the things.
You're fine.
Okay, the things that are so interesting. The other thing that's so interesting in October, and I think that is one of the questions that looms over the war, is that on October 11th, just a couple days after the attack, there is this moment on that morning where there's this sense that Hezbollah is about to launch its own preemptive attack, that there was this fear that they were going to join in. And there was intelligence that that they felt that they were seeing, that, among other things, Hezbollah has switched to using tactical radios, which was, I think, seen as like a sign that something imminent was happening. And there was there was troop movements that they were seeing in the south of Lebanon that they felt like were imminent signs of an attack. Really across the Middle East, when the Americans would look at the satellite imagery, they would see in Iraq and Syria, everything was shifting. Everybody in the region was making preparations for war in some way, shape, or form. It didn't mean that they were about to preempt, but it just meant everything looked like it was about to explode. And so that morning, Dermer, Gallant, Hanegbi called the White House, and they say, Hezbollah is about to attack, and we're going to launch our own preemptive strike. And this is the administration's biggest fear throughout this whole conflict, is that it was about to explode into a regional sort of war. And Biden calls calls Netanyahu, he calls into the war cabinet, he's put on speaker, and he says, look, if Hezbollah attacks you, we're with you. If you attack Hezbollah preemptively, essentially, you're on your own. And so that was a very powerful thing, I think, for the war cabinet to hear. But then there's these questions about the intelligence. Dermer called Jake Sullivan, and he said, we have evidence that paragliders are flying in over the northern border. And we've seen evidence that there was a funeral that was attacked by Hezbollah. And the war cabinet reconvenes, and they're so close to launching a preemptive strike. And Sullivan calls, and he tries to get hold of Dermer, and he can't get Dermer because Dermer's in this meeting. And he calls Dermer's assistant. He says, I'm going to dictate a note to you that you need to bring into the room to Dermer. And it says something like, don't make rash decisions. This is fog of war. Slow down. Be careful. Don't do anything stupid. And as it turned out that day, the paragliders were not paragliders. It was a flock of birds that were misidentified. And, at that moment, there could have been a war on the northern front. I do think that it's interesting in retrospect, especially given how successful Israel was ultimately in executing its plan in the north. What would have happened if on October 11th they had launched that preemptive strike? What if the pager attack and everything else had unfolded at that early stage in the war, I think with retrospect, as I think about it, I think Israel would have been able to reestablish deterrence through doing that. It would have felt maybe a greater sense of its own self-confidence, which had been shattered on October 7th. Maybe that would have transformed some of the diplomacy that happened as it relates to Gaza, where Israel would have negotiated from a position of strength as opposed to one of insecurity as it happened. Over the course of the months, I think we go through October. We have the hostage negotiation in November. One of the things that I heard in October that will always stick with me is that when Tony Blinken went into Doha and was meeting with it was meeting in Qatar, he heard from the emir that that Hamas actually in October. This was in the first week of October, second week of October, that Qatar said that Hamas actually they'd been so successful beyond their wildest dreams on October 7th at kidnapping Israelis, that they had children that they'd never planned on capturing, they didn't know how to deal with, and that they were ready, in the second week of October to make a deal. And that the emir said, but the problem is we haven't been able to get the attention of the government to focus on that. And so he asked, Blinken calls Dermer that afternoon, and it's true. It's like that there was just this sense of discombobulation and being overwhelmed at that early stage in the war, where the government just wasn't able to, it was focusing on a million different things. They were still fending off on October. They were still fending off attacks for days. They were so overwhelmed with everything. They were like they didn't focus when that came across their transom, which didn't mean necessarily that Hamas was about to do this, but it did. To the Americans, it felt almost unbelievable. I had one American. This is another moment from my reporting that will stick with me in a very powerful sort of way. I had one American who was having conversations with Israeli counterparts constantly, and she was asking all the time about like the hostages and about prioritizing the hostages. And she said that she actually broke down in tears just because she felt as if the government just wasn't prioritizing them at that early stage, and it just shattered her to feel like it wasn't the Israel that she knew at that moment. Sorry, to advance the story a little bit, I'll just give you the broad outlines of what happens from there. So there's the hostage deal in November, where there's this mutual convergence of interest. Israel had always planned on pausing after that first fight in northern Gaza. Hamas had these children. They had more hostages than they could deal with. They had a reason to give them up at that moment. And then there was this next phase of the war. And I think the Americans felt like over time they were able to convince the Israelis to kind of pay greater heed to civilian casualties, that they felt like some of the bombing in the first phase of the war was indiscriminate, and that by the time they got to some of the second and third phases of the war, they felt as if the Israelis were taking greater care to prevent civilian damages. It may not have been exactly what the administration wanted, but they had done their own review, in fact, of Israeli procedures, and they felt as if it wasn't that different from America's own procedures when it comes to taking precautions as it relates to civilian casualties. And there would be these conversations within the White House where some of the younger, more progressive aides would start complaining about civilian casualties. And then you have other people like Brett McGurk, who presided over the campaign against ISIS. And he would say, you know what? This is kind of what we did. Like we flattened Mosul. Like this is what happens in this type of warfare. And there were other moments where like the Israelis would come and they'd be like, you know what? Everything we're doing, we learned in your war colleges, and which was a pretty, I think, effective retort in some of these conversations as it relates to civilian casualties. But I think that there are two debates that are happening about civilians in Gaza that need to be disentangled. The first is about civilian casualties, which I just spoke about, where I think the Americans felt like, felt okay about what Israel was doing. And then the second was about humanitarian aid, where the Americans definitely had a difference of opinion with the Israelis, where they felt as if it took the government a very long time to kind of wrap its mind around the idea that it had to get sufficient amounts of aid into Gaza, and that was just a source of constant frustration for Biden. And it was the place that he felt like he was banging his head on the wall the most. And it wasn't really until I would say like March of this year that they felt like the government was taking more meaningful action. And even then, I went with Blinken to Jordan and to the border with Gaza, and he would say, like, I'm hearing these reports from Kogat that are pretty convincing, but he was kind of, I think there was he wasn't totally sure what exactly was happening on the ground, because there are limits to American intelligence, I think, in these sorts of situations, and there's a lot, there's chaos, right? And so in a situation where there's actually chaos, it's hard to know what's true and what's not true. Flashing forward, I think there's a moment at the beginning of this last year, in January, where the administration goes back to Saudi Arabia, and they go to MBS and they say, like, are you willing to re-engage with normalization talks despite the war? And MBS, kind of to their surprise, is willing to do this, in part because I described to you how he felt like he needs progressive Democrats in the Senate to vote for this treaty. He felt like he didn't know if the Biden administration would extend into a second term, and he felt like he had a better chance of getting a Saudi normalization treaty in a Democratic administration than in a Republican administration, because Democrats would almost axiomatically oppose a deal that was negotiated by Trump, but they would support a deal that was supported by Biden, and that there were enough Republicans in the Senate who, because of their feelings about Israel or their feelings about Saudi Arabia, who would join a coalition to support this. MBS tells them, I don't care that much about the Palestinians, but I need to do this in order to. Most of my population is under the age of 35, and they're consuming this war through social media, and they've developed strong feelings about the Palestinians. So I definitely need a more robust Palestinian statehood promise now than I needed on October 6th. And Blinken takes this to Netanyahu. He sees MBS one day, he sees Netanyahu the next day, And inside the meeting, he asked Netanyahu, are you still willing to do Saudi normalization? And Netanyahu tells him, yes. And he says, all right, well, this requires two things. It requires there being quiet and calm in Gaza, and it requires some commitment to Palestinian statehood. And Blinken and Netanyahu says, I can give you both. Like we can finesse the language on Palestinian statehood to be something that will be acceptable to me. We can wordsmith it. And I can get you quiet in Gaza. And this is in January. And then Blinken goes into the war cabinet with Netanyahu. And the war cabinet is talking about escalating the conflict in Gaza. And Blinken pulls Netanyahu aside after this meeting, and he says, Mr. Prime Minister, that wasn't what we talked about. And Netanyahu tells him, I'm working on it. And this is kind of, I think, in essence, if I were to describe it, there's like this repeat of the same story over and over again, where Blinken or Biden will have a conversation with Netanyahu, and they'll say, can we get more aid into Gaza? And Netanyahu will be like, I'm on it. And then they'll call him up again and say, like, wait, you just promised us this one thing, and it hasn't happened. And that produces this growing sense of, I think, frustration that especially Biden has with Netanyahu. I noticed that there was almost a distinction between Biden and the rest of his administration, that Biden, I think, Biden comes from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He comes from this very working class, and he has a whole theory about gratitude. And he felt like, I came to Israel. I'm giving you all of these weapons. Like, you have to show me a little bit of gratitude for what I've done. And instead, you kind of mislead me and you ignore me. And his frustration begins to escalate, which is a little bit different than, I think, Jake Sullivan and some of the other people in the administration who are they can see some of Netanyahu's political interest, and they're willing to be a little bit more generous to Netanyahu. But there are times when Joe Biden just doesn't want to talk to Netanyahu because he's so frustrated with him. He's so he took his treatment of him personally, which of course escalates to this point where Netanyahu makes this video about how Biden is cutting off arms, and that the Biden actually has made this decision to slow down the delivery of certain weapons to Israel because he feels like he's been misled and ignored and lied to at various moments. And that's happening even after America is making this incredible is gone through this incredible act of orchestrating the defense of Israel in April, and when Iran attacks it, which is, I think, it's happening even after various things. The Israelis are surprising the administration about some of the kind of the assassinations in Damascus and Beirut, and they're not taking it personally. They're saying, okay, like, you've surprised us on this one thing. It doesn't seem like it's great, but we're still going to work together to defend Israel. We're going to supply you these air defenses. On a technical level, what happened in April is stunning. I mean, the complexity of this tapestry of air defenses, which is multinational, involves incredible military diplomacy, where General Kurilla is going to these capitals throughout the Middle East. He's convincing Israel's old enemies to engage in its defense. You have various systems that are so complicated and not integrated being coordinated. You have things being shot down from sea, drones being shot down from sea, from air. You have missiles being shot down from space, and it's happening like this. And it would not have happened if you did not have the diplomacy on top of the military technology. And I think it's so fascinating to talk to the professionals versus the politicians. And this is like the oldest story in the world. But the professionals have like such a warm, deeply integrated relationship with one another. The relationship between Bill Burns and David Barnea, for instance, is like, there's like this, they're on the same page. Or, the way in which the IDF chief of staff and Kurilla are kind of exactly on the same page. It's like a very mature, a very evolved, incredibly professional relationship versus, the Netanyahu Biden relationship, which is filled with personal enmity and dysfunction and completely different from that sort of relationship. As it relates to the hostage negotiations as we go on, okay. All right. The hostage negotiations as we go on. I think there's a lot of controversy over this. There's a lot of different reports. Like, was there a deal for the taking at a certain moment that Netanyahu backed away from? I think that's a question that everybody has. My sense is that you would have these moments where there was never a deal that was that close. It was about what I would describe as body language. That you'd have moments where, like, Hamas was maybe looked like they were more inclined to make a deal, and maybe there would be a moment where Netanyahu would back away, or there'd be a moment where Netanyahu was leaning into a deal and Hamas would back away. But I don't think that a deal was ever that close. The closest there was to a deal, sadly, tragically, devastatingly, was just before the 6 hostages were killed at the very end of August. That was the moment where the administration felt, right before then was the moment the administration felt most optimistic, that they felt as if Netanyahu had backed away from some of his more maximalist demands. They felt as if Hamas's body language was more inclined to compromise. They weren't there. They were still a distance away. And as we know, the closer you get to a deal, the further away it can sometimes feel. But then I would talk to the administration after the death, especially after Hirsch's death, because I got to know Hirsch's family well. They were just they are John and Rachel are just like, to me, the like the best face of Zionism, like the most incredible human beings, they're moral, to me, they're moral exemplars. And people like Jake Sullivan got to know, we're talking to them all the time. I mean, the hostage families are incredible in that in the midst of all of their grief and anger, they're also diplomats, and they're conducting their own negotiations with governments around the world. They have their own independent relationship with the administration. And I think there was this very poignant moment after Hirsch's death where Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, McGurk get on the phone and they ask themselves, what could we have done differently? What could we have done? How could we have saved Hirsch? And they couldn't think. They would play it all. They played it all through their head over and over again, and they didn't know. There was no answer to that question. But Sullivan just kept saying to himself, like, I failed. Like, I should have found a way to save Hirsch, and I didn't.
All right, so on that note of regeneration and the half glass full, right? So I want to thank Franklin for a wonderful talk. And thank you all for attending. Thank you for the audience at home, and thank you.